They say that nobody remembers who came in second. Well, that's not true around here. We see you, all 58 of you who made it to the Super Bowl only to lose it, and we're here to rank you all the way from 58th to 1st. This isn't solely based on their performance in the Super Bowl though, we will be taking their entire season into account. And as usual, we will be using C-score because we know, and you, the intelligent audience, knows that not all records are created equally. So as usual, you may see some teams with very good records ranked lower than you expect, and some teams with less stellar records ranked higher than you may expect. And as always, a deeper explanation of C-score is available in this video's description. If you haven't done so already, be sure to check out our rankings of Super Bowl champions, also linked in the description below. Thank you for joining us today. Without further ado, let us begin. At the very bottom of this list is the 1979 Los Angeles Rams, and they couldn't even get their C-score to a positive number, coming in at negative 7.49, meaning they were below average. They weren't able to finish in the top 10 in points scored, points allowed, and were outside the top 20 in strength of schedule, only going 9-7 and taking 4 multiple possession losses. Yet they won the NFC West and clawed their way into the Super Bowl. Yet with all of that said, they led the vaunted Pittsburgh Steelers, looking to win their 4th Super Bowl in a 6-year span. And they led at the end of the first quarter, at halftime, and at the end of the third quarter before Pittsburgh's big 4th quarter put the game away. It would have been a monumental upset had the Rams won, and probably would have raised their C-score into the positive territory, but maybe not by that much. It's crazy though that in a 7-year span of 7 consecutive division titles, that this Rams team, by far the worst of that bunch, was the team that made it to this point. We check in with another 9-7 NFC West champion in the 2008 Arizona Cardinals, who barely scraped by a positive C-score with .119. They did have the offense though, 3rd in the league, but the defense wasn't up to snuff, and they wound up only outscoring their 27th hardest schedule by a single point. They were slightly better in their multiple score games, going 6-4 as opposed to going 3-3 in their 1-score games. This Cardinals team is the classic example of it's not how you start, it's how you finish. They lost 2 games in a row after clinching the division before beating the Seahawks in the season finale to sweep their division, and that momentum carried into the playoffs through to their Super Bowl run. Like the Rams before them, they led this game in the 4th quarter, but they led it very late. This was before Santonio Holmes famously toe-tapped his way into the hearts of Steelers Nation. But before that happened, they were victimized by the greatest play in NFL history, the James Harrison pick 6 to At number 56 here, we see the C-score rising into the 3 range with the 2003 Carolina Panthers. They went 11-5 but played 12 one-score games, putting up a .750 win percentage in those games. Their offense was straight middle of the road, the defense was slightly better, 10th overall in the league, allowing 304 points, while finishing with the 2nd easiest strength of schedule. Several teams with better point differentials missed the playoffs, but Carolina's +21 was enough to get them in. The Panthers' playoff win against the Rams came on the first play in double overtime, which then led them to that upset in Philadelphia in the NFC title game. Not too many people gave them a chance against the Patriots, and they were consensus touchdown underdogs, but they certainly gave it a go, matching the Patriots punch for punch, with each team scoring 4 touchdowns and a field goal. However, New England successfully converted a 2-point conversion, while Carolina failed on their 2 attempts for that 3-point difference. And of course, there's John Casey's out-of-bounds kickoff late in the game. We have our first surprise here at number 55 with the 1999 Tennessee Titans and their gaudy 13-3 record. They had to fight through 8 one-score battles, winning 7 of those, They were 7th in the league in scoring, middle of the road 15th in points allowed, against a very weak schedule. All that added up to a C-score of just over 8. This team is best remembered for sweeping the Jacksonville Jaguars, giving them all 3 of their losses they had that season. But they were struggling to win a lot of games, including that wildcard game we see here against Buffalo, where they needed the Music City Miracle to pull off the win. And the close games continued. For the second straight entry, we have a Super Bowl that wasn't decided until there were single-digit seconds remaining in the game. In this case, it wasn't decided until there were 0 seconds remaining, when Titans wide receiver Kevin Dyson wasn't able to get that last yard he needed that would have potentially taken the game into overtime. The Titans trailed 16-0 in the third quarter before making a valiant comeback led by 2 Eddie George touchdown runs. For Rams fans, it's known as the tackle. In Tennessee, it's simply 1 yard short. Coming up next at 54 is a surprise unit, the 2021 Cincinnati Bengals, a team that hadn't won a playoff game in over 3 decades. They got into the playoffs with a 10-7 record, the first season the NFL implemented a 17-game schedule. To their detriment was that 4-5 record in one-score games, but to their benefit was that offense that scored 460 points, ranking 7th in the league. Their only problem here, which brought their C-score down, was that strength of schedule being last in the league. Once the playoffs started, though, they got much better at one-score games, winning all 3 of their games in the AFC playoffs by those kinds of margins to get into the Super Bowl. The 2021 playoffs as a whole were one of the weirdest on record, and if they were replayed 100 times, I'm not sure any one Super Bowl matchup would repeat more than 10 times. But here in the real world simulator, we got the Bengals and the Rams. And for the Bengals, it was their 3rd time losing the Super Bowl to a team from California. It wasn't for a lack of effort though, and when T. Higgins opened the second half with a 75-yard touchdown, things were really looking up. It was Cooper Kupp though who did the damage on the final drive, touching the ball 4 times and scoring the game-winning touchdown. We've just about reached double-digit territory in C-score. The 1994 San Diego Chargers are 53rd with a 9.918. They went 11-5, but really they entered the playoffs on a 5-5 run after starting the season 6-0. They were top 10 in points scored and points allowed. They got away with only a 500 record in one-score games, but the strength of schedule was low. It was their 2 playoff victories by a combined 5 points that didn't exactly strike fear in anybody's hearts. The Chargers as a franchise aren't all that associated with winning, at least not when it matters most. And in this, their only ever Super Bowl appearance to date, they were heavy, and I mean heavy underdogs. Try 18.5 points. That 49-26 final score, incidentally covering the point spread, is itself deceiving. The 49ers took a 42-10 lead in the third quarter before essentially taking their foot off the gas. The 75 combined points scored in this game remains a Super Bowl record. But nearly 30 years later, they continue to search for their next Super Bowl appearance. And now we've reached double-digit in C-score. Clearing the 10-point threshold all the way to just over 11 are the 1987 Denver Broncos, coming in at 52nd. A top 10 offense, 4th in scoring, 7th in points allowed. A good record in 2-score games, 7-1 against an overall 10-4-1 record. The strength of schedule wasn't that great though, and they endured a very close game in the AFC Championship to make it to Super Bowl 22. The Broncos are the first team we've seen on this countdown that were favorites in their Super Bowl, giving away 3 points against the Redskins, and that ticket was looking very promising. A 3-and-out by Washington was followed by a 56-yard touchdown on Denver's very first play of the game. They entered the second quarter leading 10-0, and then all hell broke loose. In that quarter alone, the Redskins put 35 points on the board, leaving the Broncos to wither on the vine. At the time, and for many years later, it was the largest blown lead in Super Bowl history, and Denver walked off the Super Bowl field losers for the second straight season. As the New York Giants of 2000 hit the gateway of the millennium, on this countdown they come in at 51st, the gateway into the top 50. They went 12-4 and won every single one-score game they played. Very mediocre offense, but a very good defense, coming in allowing the 5th fewest points in the league against the 2nd easiest schedule in the league. The NFC was down this season, and the Giants were able to find their way through, including a big shutout in the title game over the Vikings to make it to the Super Bowl. Like the Broncos in the entry before them, the Giants were the number 1 seed in their conference, and even though they were up against a wildcard team in the Ravens, they were underdogs, but only by 3 points. Well, the Giants failed to even score 3 points on offense, racking up their 7 points on a kick return that itself was sandwiched between a Ravens pick 6 and their own kick return. For the 3rd time in Super Bowl history, and for the first time in over a quarter century, a team's offense took the bagel in a Super Bowl. But at least the Giants can say they did so against a historic defense. At number 50 is a familiar face and the first repeat franchise on this list, the 1986 Denver Broncos, with a C-score hovering just over 12.5. Spoiler alert for those who don't know, we'll be seeing more of the Broncos later on. They only outscored their opponents this season by 51 points, going 11-5, but they did this against what was tied for the league's strongest schedule. They struggled in the playoffs, winning by 5 and 3 points, but wins are wins, and they were able to advance to Super Bowl 21. This was the Broncos' first Super Bowl appearance of the 1980s, a trip they would make 2 more times, each one increasing the frequency of their heartbreak. This game didn't start off too out of hand for them. They even held a 1-point lead at halftime, before the wheels fell off in the second half. The Giants ripped off 24 straight points, and we had our 3rd consecutive NFC over AFC blowout in the Super Bowl, a trend that would continue for the next decade with a close game or 2 mixed in for good measure. At a time where wildcard teams infrequently made it to the Super Bowl, the 1992 Buffalo Bills did just that. They were in fact the wildcard, going 11-5 and losing the division to the Dolphins. Their offense was as good as it ever was, 3rd best in the league at scoring. Their defense was mediocre, strength of schedule near the bottom. They got their revenge on the Dolphins by losing the division to them, but beating them on their field in the AFC title game to get to the Super Bowl. But this playoff run started with a miracle, as the Bills famously came back from 32 points behind to beat the Houston Oilers in the wild card round. While this is no longer the largest comeback in NFL history, it remains the largest comeback in playoff history. Destiny seemed to be on their side, and in the Super Bowl, after a blocked punt led to a touchdown, they led the Cowboys 7-0. Needless to say, that didn't last, as Buffalo completely fell apart, turning the ball over a barely conceivable 9 times and got outscored 52-10 moving forward. Only Don Beebe stripping Leon Lett short of the goal line kept this from being the most points ever allowed in a single Super Bowl. After going 16 years without a Super Bowl appearance in 1995, the Steelers made their return. They're at 48th place with a C-score just under 14. They went 11-5 and were much better in 2-possession games than there were in the 1-possession games. Top 5 in points scored and points allowed, tied for 20th in strength of schedule. Not terrible, but not stellar either. Rejuvenated under young head coach Bill Cowher, the Steelers seemed destined to make the Super Bowl the season before, only to be upset by the Chargers. They made it this season though, and after falling behind in the game 13-0, they clawed back to a 20-17 deficit, and they had the ball. Unfortunately, Neil O'Donnell happened, and for the second time in the game, an errant pass landed right in the arms of Cowboys corner Larry Brown. Clearly, these plays involved some kind of communication between O'Donnell and his with all of the blame. Given that they're associated so much with winning, it may be surprising to hear that the New England Patriots are tied for the most Super Bowl losses of all time with the Broncos. This is the first of their 5 appearances, the 1985 team at 47th place with a C-score just over 14. More defensive than offensive. They were 6th in points allowed, 10th in points scored. They played a difficult schedule. They had a difficult division. They were in the top 10 there. An 11-5 record that was balanced between 1 and 2 score games. Now, the manner in which the Patriots were absolutely routed in Super Bowl 20, and the fact that they were the first ever 5 seed to reach the game in the first place, may lead some to believe that they would be much lower on this list. While 47th isn't exactly the upper echelon, there are 11 Super Bowl losers ranked lower than them. This Patriots team was far from bad, making the playoffs in what we mentioned was a competitive AFC East, where the 11-5 Broncos in the West were left out. But no one was taking this Bears team down. There's nothing anyone can look back on and say, had New England done this or that differently, that it would have made a difference. The Patriots and the Broncos may hold the record for the most Super Bowl losses, but nobody can hold a candle to 4 in a row. We're here at 2 of 4 with the 91 Buffalo Bills, around 14.5 at C-score. Definitely more offensive. They were 2nd in the league in scoring. They were below average, 19th in points allowed. That strength of schedule is really what brings them down here. Easiest in the league, despite a 13-3 record and 8 multiple possession victories. The Bills returned to the Super Bowl with much hope after barely losing the season before. But even though we had watched their opponents, the Washington Redskins, all season, we didn't truly realize what kind of greatness we were looking at. Our last entry, the Patriots, lost to the top-ranked team in C-score for the entire Super Bowl era. And this Bills team lost to the 2nd highest ranked team. It's kinda interesting that they landed on this list next to each other. Even that final score of 37-24 is deceiving, as Washington held a commanding 27-point lead early in the 4th quarter and were never at any risk at any time of losing. And now we've arrived at that 4th Buffalo Bill team from 1993 here at 45th. Their C-score is less than half a point higher than the 91 entry. They went 12-4, they won their share of close games, but they did well in multiple possession games as well. This was a more balanced team. They finished 7th in scoring and 5th in points allowed, and they had a tougher schedule as well. In their final hurrah, Buffalo stepped onto the Georgia Dome field. Their 4th consecutive Super Bowl, yes, but also the 2nd consecutive season they were facing the Dallas Cowboys. This remains to date the only time that the Super Bowl was a rematch of the previous season. And unlike that game before, Buffalo looked like they had a chance here. They had the ball in the 3rd quarter, leading the game by 7 when Leon Lett happened. Infamous for his fumble the season before, he forced the fumble that tied the game for Dallas. Buffalo was useless thereafter and gave up 17 more points in that 30-13 loss. Speaking of the Cowboys, let's take a look at them here at number 44, the 1975 team, with a C-score getting past 16 points. They were balanced but not spectacular, 8th in scoring, 9th in points allowed, 21st best strength of schedule, tied for out of 26 teams. They did well to win 6 games by multiple scores amongst a total 10-4 record. The Cowboys had finally broken through 4 years earlier and won the Super Bowl, but they hadn't been able to get back despite making it to 2 more NFC Championship games. Here they were though, and the NFC's wildcard entrant at that, against the defending champion Steelers, who brought a much better team into this game than they did in their previous Super Bowl winning season. Yet, Dallas fought them hard before ultimately falling by 4 points. We've now arrived at the pretend 2020 NFL season and its Super Bowl loser, the Kansas City Chiefs. 43rd on the rankings, 17.25 on the C-score. And the Chiefs have a gaudy 14-2 record here, but 8-1 in one-score games meant that record is a bit inflated. They had a high-powered offense, finishing 6th in scoring, and they were 10th in points allowed, fairly balanced against the middle-of-the-road schedule. But we called it a fake season for a reason. We said in the video ranking the Super Bowl champions, and we'll say it again in this one. Of the 58 Super Bowls that have been played to date, this game was the worst in overall quality. A quintessential send-off to the dumbest and most inconsistent season played since the very, very, very early days of the NFL. Nothing much else to see here. Let's revisit the New England Patriots, this one from 1996, coming in 42nd with a C-score just under 17.5. Definitely a more offensive team here, outscoring their opponents by over 100 points, finishing second in scoring, 14th in points allowed. Yes, a very low strength of schedule there. An 11-5 record that was balanced pretty well between one and multiple possession games. It took Bill Parcells 4 seasons as head coach of the New York Giants to get them into the Super Bowl, and it took that same 4 seasons for him to get the New England Patriots there as well. Unlike with that Giants team though, New England was up against a juggernaut in the Green Bay Packers, who ranked out as the 3rd greatest Super Bowl champion of all time. But for a terrible second quarter in which the Pats were outscored 17-0, they could have had a great shot at winning this game. They had it within 6 points in the third when Desmond Howard's kickoff return for a touchdown ended matters. We're getting a rise of more than 1 full point in C-score here with our next entry, the 1981 Cincinnati Bengals at 41st. They went 12-4, losing 2 games each by 1 score and multiple scores, but they won more games by multiple scores, scoring 421 points, good for 3rd in the league, 12th in points allowed, and the 2nd easiest schedule in the league. Born into the AFL in 1968 and finding themselves in the NFL just 2 years later, the Bengals had put together a good season here and there, but this was truly uncharted territory. Moreover, they found themselves in Super Bowl 16 against 49ers head coach Bill Walsh, a longtime Bengals assistant coach who was overlooked for the head coaching job in favor of Tiger Johnson, ironically a former 49er player. Johnson lasted 3 seasons and wasn't the coach for this game, while Walsh built a dynasty that began in this game, where the Bengals fought hard but ultimately fell in defeat. We're getting right back to another Bengals entry at number 40 with the 1988 team, and their profile is nearly identical to the 81 team. Better in 2-score games, but not as good on defense. Strength of schedule a little bit better, 5th from the bottom instead of 2nd from the bottom. But this is essentially the same team, and C-score only separates them by about 0.16. And adding to the parallelism, here the Bengals once again find themselves in a Super Bowl matchup with the 49ers. Whereas their first defeat to the Niners began that dynasty, this one solidified it. This game was a different kind of close though. When Cincy lost Super Bowl 16 by 5 points, it was because they scored very late to make the score look a little closer. When they lost this game by 4, it's because the 49ers scored very late, taking the lead away from them. It pretty much came down to the fact that the 49ers had Jerry Rice and the Bengals didn't, as he was the major difference in this game. We go back to the 1974 season, the first season in which the NFL instituted playoff seeding, and here we find the Minnesota Vikings, clearing the 19-point threshold in C-score. They went 10-4, an impressive 6-1 in multiple score games, 5th in the league in points scored, 3rd in points allowed. It's kind of funny to see under 200 points only being 3rd, even in a 14-game schedule. That's how much the NFL has changed to help the offense. They were brought down by the league's easiest schedule. This was the Vikings' 3rd bite at the apple toward winning a Super Bowl, but they were afflicted with the same issues that will plague them throughout this entire run of infamy. They simply couldn't score. Their defense performed admirably, allowing Pittsburgh only 2 offensive touchdowns, and they only trailed by 3 points in the second quarter. But as we said, the offense couldn't score, not at all, only getting on the board as the result of a blocked punt that they recovered in the end zone. Hell, they couldn't even make the extra point, and they took the 16-6 loss. This may come as a surprise. Barely clearing 19 points in C-score at 38th are the 2009 Indianapolis Colts. And that 14-2 record doesn't really tell the story, as they decided to rest for the playoffs the last 2 weeks of the season and took 2 losses. But they weren't as dominant as you might think an undefeated team would be, going 8-0 in one-score games and outscoring their opponents by 109 points, finishing 7th in points and 8th in points allowed against a lower-level schedule. Still, the Colts glided into the Super Bowl, and they weren't just seen as the favorites in this game by the odds makers, the so-called experts, and the general public. They were seen as the favorites by their opponents, the Saints, as well, as evidenced by head coach Sean Payton's aggressive play calling. Case in point, the surprise onside kick to start the first half. If it didn't work, chances were that the Peyton Manning-led Colts would score, something the Saints may have figured would have happened anyway. However, if it did work, then it would be an extra possession and a chance to take the lead, which is precisely what made to victory. Ranking out about a 20th of a point in C-score higher than the Colts are the 1970 Dallas Cowboys in 37th. They didn't leave much to chance during the season, going 10-4, with 11 of those games being decided by multiple possessions. They went 8-3 in those games. They had a great defense, finishing 4th in points allowed, while finishing 10th in points scored, but they did it against a top 10 schedule, tied for 8th hardest in the league. Living in the shadows of the Green Bay Packers during the late 1960s, this Super Bowl appearance represented Dallas's best chance to finally make a name for themselves, and standing in front of them weren't the juggernaut Baltimore Colts of 2 years earlier. No, this was a watered-down version that C-score ranked 3rd from bottom among every Super Bowl champion. But this game was a mess, often referred to as the Blunder Bowl, so much so that Chuck Howley was named the game's MVP, a linebacker for the Cowboys, still to date the only player from a losing side to be named MVP, and indeed the Cowboys lost on a late field goal. At the 36th spot, we clear the 20-point threshold in C-score with the 2004 Philadelphia Eagles. They went 13-3, going a stellar 9-3 in multiple score games. They only had one-score games 4 times, and they won all 4. Their defense was better than their offense, despite what the ink in the newspapers will tell you. 2nd in points allowed, 8th in points scored. They did this all against a low-level schedule, tied for 26th hardest in the league. Once the Eagles hired Andy Reid, they began their upward trajectory toward the upper echelon of the NFL. But they had to suffer through 3 consecutive NFC title game losses before finally breaking through and making it to this Super Bowl. Yet their 0-1 and 0-2 teams grade out higher in C-score. 0-4 wasn't their best bet, not only because of a very weak NFC, but also because their opponents were the defending champion New England Patriots, trotting out their best roster yet. And no matter what Freddie Mitchell thought, the Patriots were the better team and took home the Lombardi one more time. Shortly after returning to Los Angeles and coinciding with hiring Sean McVay, the LA Rams were reborn, and in 2018 they made the Super Bowl with a C-score of 20.5, coming in here at 35th. They went 13-3, and they did it behind a very strong offense. 527 points scored, 2nd best in the league. The defense, though, was 20th in points allowed, and the strength of schedule barely missed being bottom 10, 22nd hardest in the league. But this team was extremely lucky to have made it to this Super Bowl. Many would say that they didn't deserve it at all after the no PI call on Nickel Roby-Coleman in the NFC Championship game. But they made it, and they had the opportunity to prove the whole world wrong about them. Instead, this team that averaged 33 points per game during the regular season couldn't even reach 10% of that number, and they set the Super Bowl record for the fewest points allowed in a Super Bowl in a losing effort. Call the Rams lucky if you will, but the other sideline had more general luck that can ever be explained. Oh, wait a minute. We're getting closer to the halfway point. At 34th are the 1971 Miami Dolphins. 21.4 C-score behind a 10-3-1 record that included 7 wins by multiple scores. 315 points scored and 174 allowed, almost doubling their opponents, finishing 4th in scoring, third in points allowed, second easiest schedule in the league. When the AFL merged with the NFL, just about every team making the change found themselves struggling, at least in that first season of 1970. Not the Dolphins though, that was the season they started to shine. They went 10-4, made the playoffs, and only got stronger from there. This game was their first step in reaching the NFL mountaintop, and even though they set a Super Bowl record for fewest points scored in a game, a record our previous entry tied during a much more offensively friendly game, they went on to an unprecedented 3 straight Super Bowls, winning the latter 2. This C-score would have been higher had they not been humbled so much by Dallas in this game. At 33rd, we have the other side of the coin of the Miami Dolphins' undefeated season, the 1972 Washington Redskins. They went 11-3, more than half of their games were decided by multiple possessions, and they went 7-1 in those games. 7th in points scored, a very good 3rd in points allowed. Their strength of schedule wasn't great, 3rd easiest in the league. It might be known to some, and it's been mentioned before on this channel, but in Super Bowl VII, the 11-3 Redskins were slight favorites against the 14-0 Dolphins. While it is true that the matchup was closer than their records would indicate, it was probably asking a bit much of Washington to actually pull off the victory. In fact, they were the first team whose offense was ever shut out in a Super Bowl, a feat that has only been equaled 2 other times. But hey, they'll always have Garo Yepremian's epic blunder to remember upon, preventing the outright shutouts. Coming in at 32nd place are the 1989 Denver Broncos, with a C-score approaching 22.5. This is a very underrated team. They went 11-5, but they went 4-5 in one-score games. Turn a couple of those around, all of a sudden they're 13-3. And the balance shows here. They were 8th in scoring, but 1st in the league in points allowed, and they were tied for having the 5th hardest schedule in the entire league. But they're just remembered for this one game. This team gave up the most points in the history of the Super Bowl, and were defeated by the largest margin in the history of the Super Bowl. Nearly 35 years later, and those records still stand. It's because of that dreadful performance against admittedly a historically good team that the '89 Broncos aren't remembered as fondly as they should be. But of all of Denver's AFC Championship teams of the 1980s, this was indeed the best one, and by a fairly significant margin. And to think, this was the best team in the league in points allowed. That's how good the 1989 49ers were. At the edge of the top 30 are the 1997 Green Bay Packers, with a C-score approaching 23.5 points. As defending Super Bowl champions, they put up a 13-3 record, winning 9 out of 10 games by multiple scores. They took a slight step back. Instead of leading the league in points scored and points allowed, they finished 2nd and 5th respectively. Still excellent. Their strength of schedule was on the lower side, tied for 25th hardest in the league. It was always going to be tough for the Packers to follow up the historically good season they had in 1996, but they got just about as close as anyone could hope. Repeating as NFC champions from out of the 2 seed was already grounds for a successful season, but coming up just short in the Super Bowl had to leave them feeling a little empty. As 7-point favorites against the Broncos, that's the margin by which they fell short, and they had to leave that field wondering what could have been had they played just a little better. Instead, by losing, they became the team that ended the NFC's insane 13-year winning streak in the Super Bowl. This is the end of the bottom half of the countdown, and here at 30th are the 2006 Chicago Bears, with a C-score hovering just over 23.6. They went 13-3, 11 of those games were decided by multiple scores, and they pulled off 9 of them. They weren't too far away from leading the league in both points scored and points allowed, going 2nd and 3rd in those categories. Their strength of schedule, though, 3rd easiest in the whole NFL. It's been stated before on this channel that this team has never gotten its full due, and that they have been unduly dismissed as a very good team. I suspect many would compare them with the 2000 Giants, who showed up on this list 21 entries ago. Had they won this game, I'm not sure that their reputation would have improved too much, and all of that came down to one player, Rex Grossman. It's true he wasn't stellar, especially in big moments, and his play against the Colts in this game was quite poor, but this channel will not deny how good the rest of his team was. We were going to get to these guys at some point. At 29th are the 2016 Atlanta Falcons, an 11-5 record that was somewhat skewed by only going 4-4 in one-score games. That defense wasn't great, it got better as the season went on, 27th in points allowed, but they led the league in scoring against the middle-of-the-road schedule. As we now enter the second half of this countdown, this is the first of 3 Kyle Shanahan appearances. In this one, he is the offensive coordinator of the Falcons, and Shanahan's specialty is blowing double-digit leads in the Super Bowl, so it's no surprise that Atlanta blew a 25-point lead in this one, clearly an all-time Super Bowl record. No need to continue beating this dead horse. Moving on. Oh, those poor Minnesota Vikings. We visit them once again here at 28th, with a C-score getting pretty close to 25 points. 12-2 on the season, 9-1 in multiple score games, highly impressive. The offense was strong, 9th in points scored, but the defense was something else, giving up only 168 points, good for second in the league, and they did that against the middle-of-the-road schedule. But the Vikings' task in Super Bowl VIII was difficult. They were up against the defending champion Miami Dolphins, who, despite a slightly less perfect record, brought a much more powerful unit into this game. Minnesota fell behind 14-0 in the first quarter, which left them unable to make any kind of comeback. This was the Vikings' first Super Bowl loss since the merger, and their second overall. So they had yet to fully establish their reputation as Super Bowl losers, but that moniker would be taking full effect over the next few seasons. We looked at a defending Super Bowl champion who fell short the next season a few entries ago, and now we have another one at number 27, the 2017 New England Patriots, our first team on this countdown to clear 25 points of C-score. They went 13-3, 8-1 in multiple score games. They were top 5 in points scored and points allowed, but as was common for the Patriots during the entire Belichick era, their division wasn't very hard and their strength of schedule was only 25th. These Belichick Patriots had an odd habit of sometimes coming up short in seasons where they were either the best or second best team in the league, and this team is no exception. While their Super Bowl opponents, the Philadelphia Eagles, were by C-score the better team, this Patriots team was also better than the 2018 team, which did win the Super Bowl the following season. Some further irony is that of the Patriots' record-breaking 11 appearances in the Super Bowl, this is the one where they scored the most points, yet they still lost the game. The Atlanta Falcons have only ever been to the Super Bowl twice. We just saw the second team that did it. Here now is the first team from 1998, coming in at 26th with a C-score that's only .034 higher than the previous entry. They went 14-2, including an undefeated 6-0 record in one-score games. Very consistent, 4th in points scored and points allowed, against the middle-of-the-road, slightly higher than average, 13th ranked strength of schedule. Maybe it's recency bias, or maybe it's because this team was in the Super Bowl instead of the 15-1 Minnesota Vikings, but I would venture to guess that of the two Atlanta teams, most would have picked the 2016 team over this one, despite notching 3 fewer wins. And despite that win difference, the 98 team is only 3 spots and less than half a point in C-score better. After barely beating the 49ers and the Vikings in Minnesota to get here though, they didn't have much to offer the Broncos in their march to back-to-back championships. We've now cracked the top 25, and this is the area of the countdown where these C-score differences are basically negligible. This is the 2014 Seattle Seahawks, who went 12-4 and could have been much better but for that 3-3 record in one-score games. They were 10th in scoring, but as they did a lot during this era, they led the league in points allowed, and they did it with a top half strength of schedule. This, however, is the dynasty that never was. It's like they didn't want it. This Seattle team and this loss was well covered in our video ranking the Super Bowl winners. Not going to rehash that again. Moving on. This is yet another small jump in C-score, less than 1/10 of a point, for the 2010 Pittsburgh Steelers at number 24. They went 12-4, leveling out at 6-2 in both one-score and multiple-score games. As usual for the Steelers, the defense was the star of the show, leading the league in points allowed while finishing a respectable 12th in points scored, top 10, exactly 10th in strength of schedule. There have been only 2 occasions where a number 6 seed has won the Super Bowl. The Steelers were the first to do so when the 6 seed was the favorite to win, albeit by small margins. This game was looking like anything but a small margin when the Packers jumped out to a 21-3 lead. The Steelers got the margin down to 4 in the third quarter and 3 in the fourth, but down by 6, they were unable to complete the comeback when their final drive was stifled. At number 23, we're bringing it back to the very modern day. Just 2 seasons ago, the 2022 Philadelphia Eagles. They went 14-3 with 7 wins each by 1 score and multiple scores. The offense really cooked this season, 3rd in the league in scoring. The defense was also very strong, 8th in points allowed. The only reason their C-score didn't get much higher, despite their excellent performance in the NFC playoffs, was that strength of schedule, tied for 4th easiest in the league. Out of the 58 Super Bowls that have been played to date, it's nice to know that not too many of them have been controversial. But that can't be said for all of them, and this one between the Chiefs and the Eagles unfortunately falls into these ranks. Whether it was the late holding call on Eagles corner James Bradbury or the overall field conditions, Eagles fans had plenty to gripe about in this one, and they were joined by many neutrals as well. In the end, the Eagles set the unfortunate record of most points scored in the Super Bowl in a losing effort, as their 35 points fell short by 3. There's just something about the 22nd entry in these lists. On our Super Bowl champions list, this is where the 72 Dolphins fell, and on this list, we find the 15-1 2015 Carolina Panthers with a C-score just cutting on under 26. They led the league in scoring exactly 500 points. They outscored their opponents by nearly 200 points, but they did it against the league's easiest schedule and had to rely on 7 different wins by 1 score. Part of the problem for the Panthers is that the team they lost to in Super Bowl 50 lives more by reputation than actual stature. Sure, the Broncos' defense was excellent, and they had an amazing game that in a vacuum would make it easy to regard them as an all-time great defense. But they were only 4th in points allowed, never pitched a shutout, and only once held a team to single digits all season. Although they did allow exactly 10 points 3 times, including in this game. Had Carolina lost to a better opponent, given how close some of these C-scores are, then they likely would have threatened the top 10. We've mentioned that the Denver Broncos are tied with the Patriots for the most Super Bowl losses. This here was number 5, and they became the first team to lose the Super Bowl 5 times. In 2013, with their C-score just under 26. They were 13-3, a very good 10 wins by multiple scores, in fact going undefeated in those games. Led the league in scoring, no question about that, but they gave up just under 400 points, good for 22nd in the league, all of this against a bottom 10 schedule. Since 1980, 3 different teams set a new all-time record for points scored in a season before these Broncos did so again. One of those teams came up just short of making the Super Bowl, the '98 Vikings. One of those teams made it and lost a very close game, and the third team made it to the Super Bowl but got walloped. Those teams are still left to be covered on this countdown. Denver took after the walloped team, falling behind 12 seconds into the game and never even getting back to tied. Offense sells tickets, but defense wins championships. Sometimes cliches are simply the truth. We're hitting 2 benchmarks here. We've cleared 26 points in C-score, and we've made it to the top 20. These are the 2002 Oakland Raiders, the last time they've even gotten close to a Super Bowl. They went 11-5, but they had a losing record in one-score games, so that record is a little deceiving. Solid across the board, second in points scored, sixth in points allowed, and fifth in strength of schedule. It might be hard to remember now, but the Raiders were favored to win this game against the Buccaneers in what was expected to be a close contest. It turned into the equivalent of playing Tecmo Super Bowl with your friend, who was always looking at your controller when you picked your play, and in turn would blow up anything you tried. Tampa essentially had Oakland's playbook, as it was left behind by their former head coach and Tampa's new head coach, John Gruden. Oakland just never changed it. Raiders coach Bill Callahan once called his team the dumbest in America. It starts at the top, buddy. Once upon a time, the San Francisco 49ers had a 5-0 record in the Super Bowl. Not so much anymore. They've taken 3 losses, and they're all in the top 20. The first one we're looking at is 19th, the 2012 team, with a C-score about 1/20th of a point higher than the Raiders before them. They went 11-4-1, going 7-3 in multiple score games. What the strength of this team was? Defense. Second in the league in points allowed, all against the third hardest schedule in the league. The Niners were agonizingly close to making it to the Super Bowl the season before, losing at home in overtime in the NFC title game after losing a fumble on a punt return. They delved in an 18-point comeback in the NFC title game, but were unable to overcome a 22-point deficit against the Ravens, despite the obvious benefits they received from the blackout and the subsequent 34-minute delay. And in their 6th Super Bowl appearance, the Niners took their first ever loss. We go back to the beginning, the losers of the very first Super Bowl in 18th place, the 1966 Kansas City Chiefs. Their C-score is .002 points higher than the 2012 49ers. They were 11-2-1. They only had 3 games come within 1 score. Technically, 2 of them were wins, 1 was a tie. They led the AFL in points scored and were second in points allowed. They did have the easiest strength of schedule though. In one sense, the Chiefs had nothing to lose. They were not expected to win the first NFL-AFL championship game as it was known, and many suspected the game wouldn't even be competitive. In another sense, a larger sense, the Chiefs had everything to lose, as representatives of an upstart league looking to prove that the impending merger between the AFL and NFL was justified. Yet, somehow, both things happened. The Packers won by 25 points, but the Chiefs had it at a 4-point margin at halftime and were more competitive than the final score would indicate. That's almost poetic. With another minuscule leap forward in C-score at 17th place of the 1982 Miami Dolphins. They only went 7-2 due to the player strike wiping out 7 games. They did go undefeated in multiple score games, and they won all 3 of their playoff games by multiple scores, and finishing top 10 in both points scored and strength of schedule. The 1982 season does make for tough evaluations though, and it's almost a guarantee that if this Dolphins team or any other team from that season completed those final 7 games, that their C-scores would be altered in one way or another. But entering Super Bowl 17 on the backs of a shutout in the AFC title game, among 3 straight playoff wins by double digits, it's clear that this was an excellent team. Miami led this game at the end of every quarter except for the 4th, and if they're able to stop John Riggins on that 4th down, then maybe they don't appear on this particular list at all. We move on to the 16th spot where we find the 1980 Philadelphia Eagles, a 12-4 team that lost 2 games each by 1 score and multiple scores, but they covered that with 8 multiple score victories. They were 6th in scoring and had the league's #1 defense in points allowed, against a strength of schedule that just missed being in the bottom 10. The Cowboys, the Vikings, and to a lesser extent the Rams dominated the NFC in the 1970s, and they all faded to various degrees in the 80s, leaving the door open for new teams to step in. The Eagles were the first such team to take advantage, and they were in a great position to etch their names onto the Lombardi for the first time, with the wild-card underdog Raiders across the field from them. But the Eagles were quickly undone by turnovers and penalties, never finding themselves in true contention. Soon, the 49ers and Redskins became the NFC's top teams, and Philly also faded away. We're getting a, relatively speaking, monstrous leap forward in C-score here, as the 2005 Seattle Seahawks are half a point higher than the Eagles in the previous entry. They went 13-3, half their games decided by one score and multiple scores, and they put up a better record in multiple scores. They led the league in scoring, top 10, finishing 7th in points allowed. Their strength of schedule, not stellar, 29th in the league, in fact tied for 29th. In just their 4th season as permanent members of the NFC, the Seahawks rose to the top of the conference and made their first Super Bowl appearance. Now, we've referenced 6 seeds winning the Super Bowl, and we've referenced controversial Super Bowls. This game had both, with Seattle falling to the 6-seeded Steelers on the back of some dicey officiating, to the point where a few years later, head referee Bill Levy admitted to making some mistakes. Mike Holmgren attempted to become the first head coach to win a Super Bowl with 2 teams, but it didn't happen, and to date, it still hasn't happened. Not for him, not for anyone. The Vikings are back, this time from 1976, coming in at 14th on this list. They went 11-2-1 while taking care of business in multiple score games, going 7-0. As was the case for the Vikings in this era, it was their defense, finishing 2nd in points allowed, complemented by a good offense that finished 9th in points scored, all against a middle-of-the-road schedule. By this point, Minnesota had already lost 3 Super Bowls, without either a victory or a single point scored in the first half in any of those games. The 13-1 Raiders were a tough challenge in Super Bowl 11, but the Vikings were no slouches and had every opportunity to win this game. That is, until they took the field and fell behind 16-0 in the first half. The Vikings allowed season highs of 32 points and 429 yards, the latter of which was a then Super Bowl record. 266 of those were rushing yards, and Oakland's Willie Brown added a pick 6 for good measure. The Vikings still haven't been back to the Super Bowl. Our most recent Super Bowl loser, the 2023 49ers, are our next entry. They went 12-5, only going 1-3 in one-score games, so that record could have been a little bit better. Very consistent, 3rd in points scored, 3rd in points allowed, a top 12 schedule, tied for 12th overall. They find themselves in the unlucky spot number 13. Yet, the 49ers could consider themselves somewhat lucky to be in this game, despite their general supremacy over the conference. 3-point wins against both the Packers and the Lions weren't created equally, as a lot had to go right for them to get past Detroit. The tables turned in this most recent Super Bowl loss to the Chiefs, going down by 3 points in overtime, in yet another example of a Kyle Shanahan-helmed team losing a Super Bowl after holding a double-digit lead. Solace may be taken in the fact that it took nearly 75 minutes of play to decide this game, but it is an L nonetheless. We have another New England Patriots team that in the end couldn't get it done when it mattered most, despite being excellent. That would be the 2011 squad, who went 13-3, 9-0 in multiple score games. That record could have been even better. This was a little bit different. The offense was more the star of the show, being 3rd in points scored, while the defense was more mediocre, 15th in points allowed. Strength of schedule, bottom 4, typical with the Patriots during this era. At some point, we were going to arrive at the victims of the lowest ranked Super Bowl champion of all time, and here we are in the 12th highest spot of the losers ranking. The Patriots were rebounding from an excellent 2010 season that still saw them lose at home in shocking fashion to their division rival New York Jets. This was supposed to be their redemption of that, and redemption from a few seasons earlier, given that their opponent was the New York Giants. But they couldn't get the job done, and their final Hail Mary pass fell harmlessly to the ground. On the edge of the top 10 and nearing the edge of 30 points in C-score are the 1984 Miami Dolphins. They were in the Super Bowl 2 years earlier, but they brought an entirely different type of team to this one. They went 14-2, including 11 multiple score victories, leading the league in offense, still with a good defense, 7th best in the league in points allowed, but they did this all against the league's easiest schedule. 5,084 passing yards and 48 touchdowns is still an excellent season in the modern NFL, but when Dan Marino did that in 1984, it was literally unheard of. If we were to adjust those numbers to the modern day, the way we adjust money for inflation, Marino would certainly be well beyond 6,000 yards and 60 touchdowns. But neither one man nor one facet of the game does a Super Bowl win, and Miami's opponent in Super Bowl 19, the San Francisco 49ers, were a top-to-bottom powerhouse, dynamic in every facet. Miami had an excellent first quarter, before being held to just 6 points the rest of the way in a 22-point loss. We now enter the top 10, and we have the third of 3 49er entries, the 2019 team. They went 13-3, undefeated in multiple score games, going 8-0. They were second in points scored, 8th in points allowed, 10th hardest strength of schedule, and they won back-to-back playoff games by 17 points each. Let's not bury the lead here though. The number 10 spot is appropriate here, as this is now our third look at a Kyle Shanahan team who held a double-digit lead in the Super Bowl before losing. In this game, the Niners led by 10 in the fourth quarter, only to lose by 11. It's worth noting that the turnaround the 49ers experienced from a terrible 4-12 season to a fourth quarter lead in the Super Bowl is remarkable, but none of that seemed to matter once Patrick Mahomes threw that pass and Tyreek Hill made that catch, starting the Chiefs' ultimately successful comeback. That was the final 49er entry. Now we see the last of 5 entries from the Denver Broncos. They're at number 9 with the 1977 squad, and they're the first team on this list to break the 30-point barrier in C-score. They went 12-2, only 3 of their games needed to be decided by 1 score. They won all 3. 10th in the league in scoring, 3rd in points allowed, and as has been common for the Broncos when they make it to the Super Bowl, they had a top 10 schedule. The Broncos are indeed tied for the most Super Bowl losses, and this was the first of the bunch, sometimes forgotten about given their Super Bowl futility during the 1980s. And despite the 17-point loss, this was the closest of the 5. This was an excellent team that just picked the worst time to have a terrible game. They turned the ball over 8 times. 2 turnovers in a game isn't great, but the Broncos averaged 2 turnovers per quarter. It's almost a testament to them that they only lost by 17, as we saw the Bills turn it over only 1 more time in Super Bowl 27, only to lose by more than twice as many points. We got a quick look at the latter 3 of Buffalo's 4 straight Super Bowl losses early in this countdown. Here now is the team that started it, and by far the best of the 4, the 1990 team whose C-score crosses 32 points. They went 13-3, the Red Gun offense led the league in points scored, the defense was just about as good, 6th in points allowed, albeit all done against the league's easiest schedule. The term unbreakable record gets used somewhat liberally in the sports world, but Super Bowl 25 did provide us with a real unbreakable record. Until such time that the Super Bowl can end in a tie, or the NFL introduces fractional points, a 1-point victory, or in this case a 1-point loss in the Super Bowl, will never be topped. Whereas the rest of Buffalo's 4 consecutive Super Bowls couldn't get ranked higher than number 45, this first team, as we mentioned, was truly their best shot, only to be undone by another masterful defensive game plan from Bill Belichick. And the 2 ugliest words in the city of Buffalo: wide right. Our 7th place team are the 1978 Dallas Cowboys, with a C-score that crosses 33.5 points. A 12-4 record is obviously good, especially when 9 of those wins came by multiple possessions. Excellent balance all the way, leading the league in points, 3rd in points allowed. Strength of schedule wasn't great, but it wasn't bottom 10 either, tied for 16th out of 28 teams. There are other contenders, but in the Super Bowl era, the greatest interconference rivalry has to be Cowboys and Steelers. They are the only teams to match up in 3 separate Super Bowls, and this matchup in Super Bowl 13 was the first such rematch in the game's history. Moreover, the winner here would be the first ever 3-time champion and could lay claim to the less official title of Team of the 70s. Dallas attempted a furious comeback from down 18 in the 4th quarter, but time ran out on them, and for the second time in 4 seasons, they took a 4-point loss to the Steelers in a Super Bowl. We take a big jump in C-score here at almost 2.4 points higher than the previous entry. At number 6 are the 1983 Washington Redskins. They went 14-2. They went 3-2 in one-score games, but moreover, those were both 1-point losses. They were literally 4 points away, 2 points in each game, from perfection. And they did it on the strength of their offense, leading the league in scoring. The defense wasn't bad, a little closer to mediocre, 11th in the league in points allowed, but they were tied for the 10th hardest schedule in the league. In an era without 24 hours a day sports coverage and without social media, there were probably still some whispers around the 1983 Redskins that, yes, they were defending champions, but was that championship in a 9-game regular season the real deal? The Redskins certainly would have heard any such whispers, and they responded with a new NFL record for points scored before getting back to the Super Bowl. But anyone who has ever built a sandcastle knows that no matter how long it took to build it, it can take just seconds to make it disappear. This Redskin sandcastle washed away. We're now in the top 5, and at number 5 are the 1967 Oakland Raiders, the last AFL champion who didn't win the Super Bowl. Their C-score clears 38. They went 13-1, only leaving 4 games to 1-score differences, and they went 4-0 in those games. They slightly more than doubled up their opponents, scoring 468, allowing 233. Their strength of schedule wasn't the worst in the league, but second worst. Even though the Raiders were heavy underdogs to the Packers in Super Bowl II, still known as the AFL-NFL World Championship game, C-Score rated the Raiders as the better team, despite playing against weaker competition during the season. But it may have been that weaker competition that left the Raiders unprepared for a team that not only had the experience from that 1967 season, but all that championship experience throughout the entire 1960s. Oakland ran the ball a season low 20 times against 37 pass plays, their largest imbalance all season, reflecting the control that Green Bay had over the game. At number 4, we have the first team from the 21st century and the second highest rated team from this century in the 2001 St. Louis Rams, putting together a C-score of nearly 38.5 while going 14-2, including a 9-0 record in multiple score games. The offense was the show. They led the league in scoring, clearing 500 points. The defense made a comeback at 7th, 273 points allowed. The 99 team had the weakest schedule in the league. This team was a little bit better than that. They were 25th. The dynasty that never was. The greatest show on turf returned from a down season in 2000 due to a lack of form from their defense, certainly not their offense, to storm their way through the 2001 season. That 9-0 record in multiple score games, combined with their ridiculous 13-0 record in those games from 1999, to exhibit greatness on a different level. But Patriots head coach Bill Belichick knows a thing or two about thwarting juggernaut offenses in the Super Bowl, and he put out yet another masterful display in this one, stopping one dynasty from forming and instead starting a new one. We take a big leap forward in C-score as the number 3 entry, the 1969 Minnesota Vikings, are almost 5 full points ahead of the previous entry, clocking in at over 43. They went 12-2, and a common thread throughout a lot of these teams is that they went undefeated in multiple score games, going 9-0. They led the league in scoring, they led the league in points allowed, and that point differential of over 240 in a 14-game schedule is quite remarkable, and their strength of schedule was middle of the road. We saw 3 entries from the Buffalo Bills before we got to the first of their 4 Super Bowl losses, and now we see the Minnesota Vikings in the same boat. Those other Viking teams were good, even excellent, but this team was great. They just didn't have it in this game against the Chiefs. Maybe it was the wet conditions, maybe it was just a bad matchup, or just maybe the Vikings didn't prepare for the game the way they should have. KC jumped out to a 16-0 lead, and their defense remained stellar, coming away with a 23-7 win and leaving the Vikings without the Super Bowl they surely felt would be theirs. After that big jump in C-score in the previous entry, we have an even bigger jump now of more than 6 points. Number 2 on this list are the 1968 Baltimore Colts with a C-score of 49.371. They went 13-1 and only one of their games needed to be decided by a single possession, and they won that game. They scored 402 points, only second best in the league, while leading the league with 144 points allowed, just over 10 points per game. Strength of schedule a little on the lower side, 12th out of 16th in the league. We're going to win Sunday, I guarantee it. Those were the words spoken by Jets quarterback Joe Namath in the lead-up to their Super Bowl III matchup against the vaunted Colts. The first 2 AFL-NFL matchups weren't particularly compelling matchups, with the Packers handling business by a combined 44 points, and this Colts team seemed even more formidable. But the Jets were up to the task, forcing 5 turnovers, holding possession for over 36 minutes, and pounding the rock to the tune of 43 carries. The Colts had no answers and proved Joe Namath a prophet. The closeness in C-score might be surprising, but the team at number 1 probably won't be. The 2007 New England Patriots with a C-score of 49.893, just short of 50. Of course, they very famously went 16-0, 12 of those wins by multiple possessions. But look at that point differential. They scored 589 points, led the league of course. The defense was excellent, 4th best at 274, for a point differential of 315 points. Just 5 points short of 20 points per game. And unlike other Patriot entries that we see on this list and in their Super Bowl winning list, the strength of schedule wasn't too bad, tied for 15th in the league, right about middle of the road. What else can really be said about Super Bowl 42 history, let alone Super Bowl history, and it isn't even particularly close. The Giants' pass rush got to Tom Brady. David Tyree made the helmet catch. Plaxico Burress scored the game-winning touchdown. And the Patriots finished 18-1, where the smaller number in that record became by far the biggest number. A Patriots victory in this game, especially if it was a decisive one, may have catapulted them to number 1 on the list of Super Bowl champions, even surpassing the 1985 Chicago Bears. Instead, they must settle for number 1 on the list of Super Bowl losers. Thank you so much for getting this far into what was a long video. And by making it this far, I can only presume that you liked it. Show that by clicking the like button. And while you're at it, share the video around, subscribe to the channel, and ding that bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. It turns out that exactly 75% of the league, 24 out of 32 teams, have lost a Super Bowl at some point in its history. 4 teams have won a Super Bowl without ever losing one, while 4 other teams have never made it to the dance. There's no way I could have either left a team out or included one that I shouldn't have, but the order in which they appear can certainly be debated. Let me know if I got something wrong, let me know if I got it all right, and let me know of any other thoughts you might have down in the comments section below. I'm not gonna lie, this video was a chore and it ran into some problems, so getting it released feels absolutely great. Thank you once again for joining us today. And until next time, I hope you have an awesome day.